Michael Turner left the Marines only a few months ago. The war was behind him, but it didn't feel that way. He carried the weight of it every day in the way he woke up before sunrise, in the way sudden noises made his shoulders tighten, and in the way he struggled to rest at night. When he returned to Montana, he didn't look for a job in town or rent an apartment in the city. Instead, he drove out to the edge of the valley where his father's old farm sat. The place had been empty for years, ever since his father passed away. The fences leaned, the barn door sagged, and the paint on the house peeled. But it was quiet, and that was what Michael thought he needed most. The farm was familiar. He had grown up here, learning how to mend fences and cut hay at his father's side. Walking through the fields again felt strange, like stepping into a memory that belonged to someone else. His father had been steady, patient, and strong. Michael wasn't sure he had any of that left in him. During the day he worked the land, as best he could. He cleared brush, fixed broken boards, and split wood for the stove. The chores were simple, but they kept his hands busy and his mind from drifting too far. Nights were harder. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by dreams that dragged him back to places he didn't want to remember. He often sat on the porch with the lights off, watching the horizon in silence. Out here, no one could hear him when he woke in the dark. That was part of the reason he stayed. The neighbors were few and far between. The closest house belonged to an older woman named Mrs. Coldwell. She rarely waved, and Michael didn't mind. He wasn't looking for conversation. People asked questions, and he didn't have answers he wanted to give. Michael told himself he had come here to heal. The farm gave him space, work, and quiet. But sometimes the quiet felt too heavy. The silence pressed against him until it was hard to breathe. On those days, he wondered if he had come here to find peace or if he had only come here to hide. Still, when the sun came up over the valley, painting the fields gold, there were moments when he felt steady again, moments when the land reminded him of who he used to be. And though he didn't know if the farm could give him the peace he was looking for, it was all he had. For now, it had to be enough. Michael first noticed it one cold morning in early October. He was stacking firewood behind the barn when he saw movement across the property line. Mrs. Coldwell, his nearest neighbor, was out in her yard. She was older, thin, always carrying herself stiff like the world owed her something. Normally, he wouldn't have paid attention, but today she had a shovel in her hands. She was digging, not in her garden, but at the far edge of her backyard, near the tree line. Something about it felt off. The hole looked too wide, too deep. For planting, Michael tried to shake it off. But when he looked again, he caught sight of something else. 2 dogs. One was a German Shepherd, the other a smaller golden retriever puppy, both with thin ribs showing through their fur. They were tied to a post, barking weakly. Michael froze, a heavy feeling tightening in his chest. At first, he didn't want to get involved. It wasn't his business. He told himself that twice, maybe 3 times. But when Mrs. Caldwell glanced around, lifted the shovel again, and the dogs struggled against their ropes, the truth hit him. She wasn't digging a garden. She was digging their grave. Without thinking, Michael dropped what he was carrying and crossed the fence line. His voice came out sharp, louder than he expected. "Hey, what are you doing?" Mrs. Coldwell flinched, her face twisting with annoyance. "None of your concern, Turner. These mutts are sick. Best to get it over with." Michael's jaw clenched. Images he didn't want came rushing back. Desperate eyes, helpless faces, the weight of choices no one should ever have to make. His pulse spiked, but this time he didn't freeze. He walked straight toward the dogs. "No, not like this." Mrs. Coldwell tried to block him, waving the shovel. "They're not your problem." But Michael didn't stop. He untied the ropes with quick, steady hands. The German Shepherd pressed against his leg as if it already knew he was safe. The puppy whimpered, licking his hand. Both dogs were shaking but alive. Mrs. Cold's voice rose behind him. "You'll regret this. You think you can just take them?" Michael didn't answer. He lifted the puppy into his arms, motioned for the shepherd to follow, and walked back toward his land. Every step felt heavier, but his grip didn't loosen. By the time he reached his porch, his heart was still pounding. He set the puppy down gently and crouched beside the shepherd, checking their condition as best he could. Malnourished, weak, but their eyes were bright, and they clung to him like they had already decided he was their only chance. Michael sat there for a long moment, breathing hard. He hadn't planned any of this. He didn't want trouble with neighbors, and the last thing he needed was more responsibility. But looking at the 2 dogs, he knew there was no going back. For years, he had told himself he wasn't capable of saving anyone anymore. That part of him had died overseas, yet here they were, 2 lives he couldn't walk away from. Inside, the house was quiet as always. Outside, The wind swept across the fields, but now there were two new sounds in Michael's world: the steady panting of a German shepherd and the soft whine of a golden pup. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel so heavy. The morning after Michael brought the dogs inside, the house no longer felt like his own. The German shepherd had curled up by the wood stove resting but alert, while the puppy had spent the night whimpering until exhaustion won out. Michael hadn't slept much either. Every time he closed his eyes, one of them stirred, and he found himself listening for signs of trouble. He was used to silence. For months, silence had been his shield, but now, every corner of the house held sound: the shuffle of paws, the scratch of nails on the floorboards, the sudden bark that made him flinch when the sun rose. Michael stood in the kitchen staring at a bag of dry cereal. He had nothing for dogs. His father had never kept animals beyond the cattle, and Michael had never thought about pets. They weren't part of his plan, yet here they were, staring at him with hungry eyes. He poured a bowl of cereal, set it down on the floor. The shepherd sniffed and turned away. The puppy tried, then spat the soggy flakes out. Michael cursed under his breath. He grabbed his truck keys, drove into town, and for the first time since moving back, he stepped into the small general store. The clerk recognized him. "Turn a right. Haven't seen you around." Michael gave a quick nod. He didn't want small talk. "Dog food," he said, voice low. The man pointed him toward an aisle, and Michael left without another word. He didn't notice the curious looks that followed him out. Back at the farm, he set the bags down and fed the dogs properly. The shepherd ate cautiously, guarding every bite, while the puppy dove in with reckless energy. Watching them, Michael felt something shift: relief, maybe, or a strange warmth he hadn't felt in a long time, but the feeling was mixed with doubt. What the hell am I doing? Caring for two dogs wasn't part of his life. He was barely holding himself together. Yet now he was responsible for them. The next days were a learning curve. The shepherd, he hadn't named her yet, was disciplined, watchful, almost military in her posture. She followed him around the yard, stopping when he stopped, sitting when he sat. The puppy was the opposite. Chaos wrapped in fur. He chewed boots, tipped over water bowls, and barked at shadows. At first, Michael lost his temper. He shouted when the pup tore apart a cushion. He slammed a door when it tracked mud across the kitchen floor. The sound of his own anger startled him. It was too much like the man he didn't want to be. The dogs didn't shrink from him, though. The shepherd only tilted a head as if judging his patience. The puppy wagged its tail and came right back to him. Each mistake forced Michael to slow down, to clean up, to fix what was broken, to try again. It wasn't easy, but as the days passed, the rhythm of caring for them began to take shape. Morning feedings, afternoon walks around the field, quiet evenings by the stove. At night, when the dreams came, Michael woke to find the shepherd lying near the bed, her steady breathing anchoring him. The puppy sometimes climbed onto his blanket, without permission, a warm weight against his feet. For the first time in years, the nightmares didn't leave him completely alone. Still, the doubts lingered. Mrs. Caldwell hadn't forgotten. She had shouted across the property line twice already, threatening to call the authorities, claiming the dogs were hers. Michael ignored her, but he knew trouble was coming. He had acted on instinct, and now the consequences were waiting. One evening, he stood on the porch watching the horizon burn orange with sunset. The shepherd sat at his side, ears twitching at every sound. The puppy gnawed on a stick nearby. Michael let out a long breath. He thought about the war, about the people he couldn't save, about the nights that still haunted him. He had told himself he was finished with rescue, with responsibility, and yet, these two animals were alive because he had stepped in. Maybe that meant something. Maybe they weren't here just to be saved. Maybe they were here to save him too. The thought unsettled him. He shook his head, went back inside, and busied himself with chores. But the seed had been planted, whether he wanted it or not. By the end of that week, Michael caught himself speaking, aloud again. Simple words at first: sit, come, stay. Commands that the shepherd obeyed with sharp attention. The puppy stumbled through them, but always with joy. Then came other words, softer ones he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. Good girl, easy there, it's all right. The dogs answered in their own way, tails wagging, eyes steady, presence constant. Slowly, the silence of the farm began to change. It was still quiet, but no longer empty. Michael didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what Mrs. Caldwell might do. But for the first time since coming home, he felt like he wasn't fighting the days alone, and that was enough to keep going. The shepherd was healing, but not fast enough. A week after the rescue, Michael noticed her limp hadn't improved. The pup was fine. In fact, chewing through half the porch railings with puppy energy. but the older dog worried him. She ate, she watched, but sometimes when she shifted her weight, she whined under her breath. Michael crouched beside her in the barn, running his hand gently along her back leg. He didn't know what to look for. He'd patched up soldiers before, but dogs were different. He muttered to himself, "Damn it, this is beyond me." For hours he wrestled with the decision. He didn't want strangers here. He didn't want anyone poking into his life, but letting the shepherd suffer wasn't an option. Finally, he pulled a folded flyer from his truck's glove box. He had seen it pinned on the board at the general store. Dear Emily Carter, Mobile Veterinary Service. The number stared at him for a long time before he dialed. Emily arrived the next morning in a small pickup, the kind built for long dirt roads. She stepped out carrying a black medical bag, her boots dusty from travel. She was younger than Michael expected, maybe mid, with her brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail and a calmness in her eyes that didn't seem forced. Michael stood stiffly on the porch, arms crossed. He hadn't spoken to anyone this close in months. "You must be Mr. Turner," she said, voice steady but warm. "Michael," he answered. He cleared his throat, glanced at the shepherd waiting by the steps. "It's her leg." Emily crouched immediately, setting her bag down. The shepherd's ears flicked back, suspicious but not aggressive. Emily spoke softly to her, words low and even, as she let the dog sniff her hand. Within seconds the shepherd leaned forward, accepting her touch. Michael watched, a knot tightening in his chest. He hadn't expected it to go that smoothly. Emily examined carefully, her hands precise but gentle. "She's underweight, probably dehydrated when you found her." The leg she pressed lightly, and the dog flinched as a strain, not a break. Painful, but with rest and the right care. "She recover." Michael exhaled, more relief than he wanted to admit. "So she'll be okay?" Emily nodded, looking up at him. "Yes, but she needs proper food, time, and someone watching her progress." "You've done the right thing bringing me here." Michael shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Compliments felt foreign. The puppy, curious, had wriggled out from behind the steps and was chewing the strap of Emily's bag. She laughed, softly, pulling it away. "And this one's trouble." "Trouble fits," Michael said, surprising himself with the hint of a smile. Inside the kitchen, Emily wrote down instructions. She explained feeding schedules, supplements, and how to keep the shepherd from overexerting. Michael listened closely, though he found his attention drifting at times not from disinterest, but from the way Emily carried herself. She wasn't like the townsfolk who stared at him when he passed. She didn't pry or ask about his past. She stayed focused on the dogs, and that was a relief. Still, when she finally looked at him directly, it was like she could see more than he wanted revealed. "You've taken on a lot," she said gently. Not many would have stepped in. Michael's jaw tightened. "Someone had to." Emily nodded as if that was enough. She didn't press, and he was grateful. Before leaving, she crouched again, to stroke the shepherd's head. The dog's eyes closed, leaning into the touch. "You've got a fighter here. She'd pull through." Michael walked her back to her truck, unsure whether to thank her or just let her go. He settled for a quiet, "Appreciate it." Emily smiled, sliding into the driver's seat. "Call me if you need anything, and don't wait too long next time." The truck rumbled away, leaving dust hanging in the air. Michael stood there longer than he needed to, watching until she disappeared down the road. That evening, as the dogs slept by the stove, Michael sat with his hands around a cold mug of coffee. His mind kept replaying the day, not the examination, not the instructions, but the sound of Emily's voice, the calm way she had filled the house. For a moment, the silence after she left felt heavier than usual. He shook it off. He wasn't looking for company. He wasn't ready for it. The farm was supposed to be his shelter, not a doorway to something else. But when the shepherd lifted her head, eyes clear and steady, Michael knew the truth. These animals had dragged him into a world he thought he'd left behind. Responsibility, connection, even hope, and Emily Carter had just opened the door wider, across the property line. Mrs. Coldwell watched from her kitchen window, lips pressed thin. She had seen the vet's truck come and go. She knew exactly what Michael was doing, claiming what wasn't his. Her grip on the phone tightened. If Turner thought he could get away with it, he was wrong. The fight was only beginning. It started with a knock on the door. Michael had just finished splitting wood when he heard it. The dogs barked, the shepherd low and sharp, the puppy high and eager. Michael wiped his hands on his jeans and opened the door. A deputy stood there, hat in his hand, eyes cautious. "Mr. Turner." Michael nodded slowly. The deputy cleared his throat. "You've been served." He held out an envelope. "Complaint filed by Mrs. Coldwell. She claims ownership of the 2 dogs in your possession." Michael felt his chest tighten. He took the envelope but didn't open it right away. She's saying they're hers. Yes, sir. Claims you trespassed and stole property from her yard. It's gone to civil court. You'll need to appear. Michael's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to tell the deputy what really happened, but the man's eyes told him it wouldn't matter. The story would have to be told in front of a judge. After the truck pulled away, Michael stood on the porch staring at the paper in his hand. The shepherd pressed against his leg. Sensing his unease, the puppy sat at his feet, tilting its head like it knew something was wrong. He muttered, "Damn it, I don't want this fight." But the fight had come to him. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, the papers spread out in front of him, words blurred together: theft, damages, unlawful possession. Mrs. Caldwell had written her statement like the dogs were tools she'd misplaced, not living creatures she had tried to bury alive. Michael's thoughts twisted. He wasn't ready for courtrooms. 4 eyes staring at him, 4 questions about his past. The idea of standing in public made his stomach knot. The shepherd lay at his feet, her steady breathing grounding him. The puppy climbed into his lap uninvited, warm and heavy. Michael rested, a hand on its back, closing his eyes. For once, he didn't push the comfort away. The next morning, Emily arrived unannounced. She carried a bag of feed samples and medicine, but her eyes narrowed when she saw the papers on the table. What happened? Michael hesitated, then pushed the envelope toward her. She read quickly, her jaw tightening. "She's suing you," Emily said flatly. Michael shrugged, trying to sound calm. "Looks like it. This isn't right. You saved them. Anyone. You can see that. Doesn't matter," he said. "Court doesn't care about right. They care about paperwork." Emily leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "So what will you do?" Michael stared at the floor. "I don't know. I'm not good with people anymore. Standing up there, being washed hits not me." Emily's voice softened. "Michael, you can't let her win. Those dogs would have died in that hole. You know it, and deep down, the judge will know it, too. But you have to show up. You have to fight." Her words pressed against the wall he'd built around himself. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he wasn't strong enough, but then the shepherd limped over and laid her head on his knee. The puppy barked as if seconding the point. Michael sighed. "Looks like I don't have a choice." In the days that followed, the tension spread. At the feed store, Michael felt the stares. People whispered, curious about the ex-Marine who had stolen his neighbor's dogs. Some offered quiet nods of support. Others avoided him altogether. Mrs. Caldwell, meanwhile, made no secret of her story. She told anyone who would listen that Michael was unstable, dangerous, unfit to care for animals. The words stung more than he wanted to admit. They reminded him of whispers he'd heard after coming home from war people, unsure if he was all there. One evening, as he fixed a loose board on the porch, Emily pulled up again. She had done her homework. "I talked to a lawyer," she said, "pro bono, small-town guy, but he's good. He's willing to take your case." Michael frowned. "I didn't ask for that." "I know," Emily said simply, "but you need help. And whether you want to admit it or not, these dogs need you to fight for them." Michael studied her face, searching for pity, but found none, just steady determination. For the first time in years, someone was standing beside him, not out of obligation but choice. "All right," he said quietly, "I'll fight." The first court notice arrived 2 weeks later, date set, location printed. As he held the paper, Michael's hand shook. He wasn't afraid of danger, but the thought of a room full of eyes, of being judged, sent cold fear through him. That night, he sat outside on the porch with the dogs at his side. The fields stretched out quiet, the sky wide with stars. He spoke aloud, surprising himself. "You pulled me into this mess, both of you. Guess that means I can't walk away now." The shepherd thumped her tail against the boards. The puppy yipped and curled against his boot. Michael let out a slow breath. For the first time, he wasn't just hiding on this farm. He was preparing to step back into the world whether he was ready or not, and deep down, he knew Mrs. Caldwell had underestimated him. The courthouse sat in the center of town, a red brick building with white columns that tried to look more important than it really was. Michael hadn't been inside a place like this since his discharge hearing years ago. Back then, he had stood, stiff in uniform, answering questions about his service. Now, he walked in as a civilian, clutching a folder that felt far too light to hold the weight of his future. Emily walked beside him, calm but firm. She carried the same quiet determination she had shown from the start. On Michael's other side was James Harris, the lawyer she had found. Harris was in his 50s, round glasses. Steady voice, not flashy, not intimidating, just practical. Michael liked that. Inside, The hallway smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Every footstep echoed. Michael's heart thudded louder than any sound around him. He wanted to turn and leave, but the thought of the shepherd and the puppy back at the farm held him in place. When they entered the courtroom, Mrs. Caldwell was already there. She wore a dark dress and pearls, sitting with her attorney, a shark-suited man who looked like he thrived on arguments. She glanced at Michael, her expression smug, as if the verdict was already hers. Michael looked away. He focused on the wooden bench, on the folder in his hands. He whispered to himself, "Breathe. Just breathe." The bailiff called for order. The judge entered, an older woman with a calm but commanding presence. Everyone stood, then sat. The trial began. Mrs. Caldwell's attorney went first. He painted Michael as unstable, man with a history of violence and trauma. He spoke of trespassing, of theft, of a reckless veteran who had no business keeping animals. Every word hit Michael like a hammer, reopening wounds he thought had scabbed over. Michael kept his eyes on the table, fists clenched. His breathing grew shallow. Emily leaned closer, whispering, "Stay with me. Don't let him pull you under." Then came Mrs. Caldwell's testimony. She claimed the dogs were hers, that she had tried to put them down humanely after they became unmanageable. She spoke as if digging a hole in the woods was mercy, as if Michael had robbed her of a rightful act. When asked why she left them alive, she shrugged. "I thought it was kinder than shooting them." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even the judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Michael wanted to shout, but Harris touched his arm, a silent reminder, "Wait your turn." When it was time for the defense, Harris rose. His style was different, no theatrics, no sharp edges, just facts, steady and measured. "Mr. Turner did not steal property," Harris began. "He intervened when he discovered 2 animals abandoned and buried alive on private land at Borders, his own. What he did was not theft, it was rescued," and Michael was called to testify. The room seemed to shrink as he walked to the stand. He swore the oath, his voice low but clear. He sat, hands gripping the edge of the chair. "Mr. Turner," Harris said gently, "tell the court what you saw that day." Michael swallowed. His throat felt dry. "I was walking the edge of the property, heard whining, digging sounds. When I found them, the dogs were in a pit, dirt piled over them, still alive. And what did you do?" "I pulled them out. They were weak, scared. I couldn't just leave them." His voice cracked at the last words. He coughed, trying to steady himself. Harris nodded. "Why did you take them in?" Michael hesitated, then spoke honestly. "Because they needed me. And maybe I needed them too." Silence filled the room for a moment, then Mrs. Caldwell's lawyer pounced. "Mr. Turner, isn't it true you suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder? Isn't it true you have nightmares, flashbacks, and episodes of anger?" The words pierced deeper than any weapon. Michael froze. His palms sweated. He felt the courtroom vanish for a second, replaced by the echo of gunfire in a faraway desert. Emily shifted in her seat, her eyes fixed on him. Michael latched onto that gaze, forcing himself back to the present. "Yes," he said finally, voice steady, "I have PTSD. I won't deny that, but it doesn't make me dangerous. It makes me careful. These dogs," he paused, breathing deep, "they help me stay grounded. They're alive because I wouldn't let them die. That's not instability. That's responsibility." The lawyer smirked, but the words had landed. Michael saw it in the faces around the room. The shepherd couldn't be brought into the courtroom, but photos and a vet's report were submitted. Emily had arranged it. The report showed malnutrition, bruising, and clear signs of neglect. The judge studied the papers carefully. Emily herself was called to testify. She spoke firmly about the condition of the dogs, about Michael's care for them. She described how the shepherd leaned on him, how the puppy followed him everywhere. Her words weren't clinical, they were human. "Those dogs aren't property," Emily said, her voice calm but fierce. "They're survivors, and the man sitting there gave them a second chance. Taking them away from him now would be the cruelest thing of all." Michael felt his chest tighten again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something heavier, something warmer, gratitude. By the end of the day, closing statements were made. Mrs. Caldwell's lawyer repeated his claims of theft and instability. Harris simply said, "This case is not about property. It is about life, and the choice to protect it." The judge dismissed the court for deliberation. Michael walked out into the hallway, his body heavy, his mind exhausted. He leaned against the wall, rubbing his face. Emily touched his arm. "You did well." "Did I?" he muttered. "Yes," she said firmly. "You stood up. That's more than you thought you could do." He didn't answer, but he knew she was right. For the first time in years, he had stood in front of strangers, told the truth, and not crumbled. Now, Everything rested on the judge's decision. The courthouse was quieter the next morning. The crowd had thinned. Only a few townsfolk lingered on the benches. Michael sat in the hallway with Emily and Harris. He hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands restless. The dogs had stayed at the farm with a neighbor who trusted him. He had kissed the shepherd's muzzle before leaving, scratched the puppy behind the ears. What if I don't come back for them? The thought looped in his head. When the bailiff opened the doors, Michael's stomach twisted. Inside, the judge sat with a folder in front of her. Her expression gave nothing away. Everyone rose, then sat. This case, the judge began, is unusual. It is not often we are asked to decide whether living creatures are property or something more. The law has limits, but cruelty has none. She paused. The silence was unbearable. After reviewing testimony, evidence, and expert reports, it is clear the dogs were neglected and left in conditions unfit for life. Mr. Turner acted not as a thief, but as a rescuer. Therefore, custody of both animals is granted to him. The words hit Michael like a wave. Relief, disbelief, everything at once. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Mrs. Caldwell gasped, then hissed something under her breath. Her attorney tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a glance. This matter is closed, the judge said. The gavel struck. Michael sat frozen. Emily squeezed his arm. You won, he nodded slowly. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like release, like a door opening after years locked shut. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air felt sharper, cleaner. Reporters weren't waiting. This wasn't the kind of case that made national news. But a few locals approached, shaking his hand, muttering, "Good job," or "You did the right thing." Michael wasn't used to praise. It made him uncomfortable. Still, for the first time, he didn't shrink from it. Mrs. Caldwell stormed past them, muttering about appeals, but her words carried no weight now. She looked smaller, weaker. Michael almost pitied her, but only almost. Back at the farm, the shepherd and the puppy greeted him with wild energy. The shepherd pressed his head against Michael's chest, steady and firm. The puppy grounded around, yipping, too excited to stay still. Michael knelt, holding both of them close. "We're home," he whispered. Emily stood nearby, watching. She smiled softly. "They knew you'd come back." Michael looked up at her. He wanted to say something, thank you, maybe, or more, but the words caught. She seemed to understand anyway. That evening, the three of them sat on the porch. The sun was dropping behind the hills, painting the fields gold. Michael had brewed coffee. Emily had brought a basket of food. The dogs lay at their feet, tired from playing. Michael broke the silence. "I didn't think I could do it. Stand there, talk like that." "You did," Emily replied. "And you'll keep doing it." "Maybe," he said. He stared out at the fields. "For a long time, I didn't believe I had anything left to fight for. But those dogs, and you, it feels different." Emily's eyes softened. She didn't push, didn't rush him. She just reached over, resting her hand lightly on his. For Michael, the gesture said enough. That night, when he finally lay in bed, the house didn't feel as empty. The nightmares might still come, he knew they would, but he also knew something else. When morning arrived, he'd hear paws scratching at the door, tails thumping against the floor. He wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in years, that thought let him drift into sleep without fear. Winter came early that year. Frost painted the fields white and the mornings carried the sharp bite of cold. Michael rose before the sun, the way he always had in the Marines. But now, instead of drills or orders, there were two eager faces, waiting at the door. The shepherd stood tall and steady, already trained to guard and guide without being asked. The golden puppy, still clumsy, tripped over his own paws but wagged his tail as if every sunrise was a miracle. Michael fed them, let them run across the frosty yard, and for the first time in years, the sound of laughter as laughter broke the morning silence. Emily had begun visiting more often. At first she came to check on the dogs, bringing medical supplies or adjusting their diet. But soon her visits became less about work and more about company. She stayed for coffee, sometimes for dinner. The kitchen, once quiet and unused, now smelled of food and warmth. One evening, as snow fell outside, Emily sat at the wooden table, sketching notes on a piece of paper. "You know," she said, "this place has room for more. You could adopt rescues officially, a shelter farm." Michael looked at her, surprised. "You think I could do that?" "I think you already are," she said, glancing at the shepherd curled at his feet. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the fireplace, at the dogs sleeping peacefully, and let the thoughts sink in. The town had started to see him differently, too. After the trial, people waved when he passed, stopped to ask about the dogs. Some even brought strays to his gate, knowing he wouldn't turn them away. Michael still struggled with the noise of crowds, with sudden reminders of war, but the difference was clear. He no longer faced those moments alone. The shepherd's steady presence, the puppy's joy, and Emily's calm voice gave him anchors when the storm inside threatened to return. One afternoon, as spring pushed the snow away, Michael and Emily worked side by side fixing a broken fence. The puppy chased butterflies nearby. While the shepherd watched like a quiet sentinel, Emily paused, brushing dirt from her hands. "You've changed, you know." Michael tightened a wire, then looked at her. "For better or worse?" "For better," she said simply. He smiled faintly. "I didn't think I had this in me anymore. A home, people, even hope." "You didn't lose it," she replied. "You just needed a reason to remember." Their eyes met. No grand declarations, no rush, just an understanding, steady and sure, like the ground beneath them. That night, as the sun sank over the hills, Michael sat on the porch with Emily beside him, and the dogs with their feet. The air smelled of grass and earth, the promise of new life everywhere. He thought about the man he had been when he first stepped onto this farm, broken, closed off, certain that healing was impossible. And then he thought about the man he was now, still scarred, still fighting but no longer alone. The shepherd lifted his head, alert, while the puppy nudged Michael's hand for attention. Michael reached down, resting his palm on both of them. "This," he said quietly, almost to himself, "this is enough." Emily leaned against his shoulder. For Michael Turner, the war wasn't erased. The past would always be there, but for the first term, the future felt bigger than the shadows, that felt like a beginning.